Hey guys, how's it going? It's Travelin' Beat here. In this video, we're going to be talking about my comparisons between the Durston XMid Pro 2 and the Z-Pax Duplex. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I just finished up my Triple Crown on the Pacific Crest Trail this year. I was carrying the Durston XMid Pro 2 from the beginning of that trail, about 1,200 miles or so to Quincy, California, at which point I decided I had had enough of that tent, and I asked my wife to mail out my Z-Pax Duplex. The Z-Pax Duplex, of course, I had carried on my entire thru-hike of the Appalachian Trail in 2021, as well as my entire thru-hike of the Continental Divide Trail in 2022. So with the Duplex, I have just about 6,000, 7,000, something like that, miles of experience with that tent. And the Durston, it took about 1,200 miles before I decided I had had enough. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these tents pitched up. We'll take a look and I'll get into the nuts and bolts of how I compare the two. So now that we have both tents all pitched up, first off, the easiest thing you're going to notice is just that the Durston is exponentially larger than the Duplex. But before we get into some of those specifics, I just wanted to talk briefly about why I felt I should get the Durston, particularly given all of the success I had had with the Duplex. Well, the Durston was really the hot tent of 2022. This is the year I spent on the Continental Divide Trail, and I was really enticed by its overall geometry and aesthetic. I thought definitely lent it to more weatherworthiness than the Duplex. It's obviously, it pitches way closer to the ground, and just sort of like the angles of some of the panels moving along the tent, I thought really looked enticing for weatherworthiness. Beyond that, the zipper door opens in an upward direction rather than Duplex where the zipper and the door lays flat on the ground in front of you. So that's another kind of bonus. And then it also has these sort of interesting vents up in the peak. So this one's closed up, but we'll see around on the other side that they kind of pitch up with these little sticks, these little material, I don't know what, 4-inch long sticks. As they're pitched up right now, indeed, the Durston is using 6 stakes. So this is the 4 corners of the tent, as well as an additional stake to pin out the vestibule. The Duplex right now is pitched as I would usually pitch it, using 5 stakes. So that's 4 for the corners, 1 for each ridge line, and then 1 for a little cantilever up at where my head would be in the tent, just to kind of pull the Dyneema up and away from me a little bit for a little more comfortable night in the tent. So aside from some of those rather enticing features of the Durston, another reason I decided to get a new tent after my Duplex was, for one, I just wanted to try a new piece of gear. And frankly, my Duplex, I'd put a few holes in it along the course of the Appalachian Trail and the Continental Divide Trail. Obviously, I've patched these up using either tenacious tape or Dyneema tape. But yeah, with those few holes and then a couple other things, I was worried about whether it'd be able to hang with me through the entire Pacific Crest Trail. So I thought, well, let's get some new exciting gear and see how that holds up for me. So another sort of neat selling point of the Durston was that the vestibule pins up using these little magnetic flaps. So you can just roll up the Dyneema material and then peg it back with this magnet. There's a magnet in here and a magnet sort of in the tent body itself, and they just sort of pin up real easy. Well, it's a great idea and it's really handy. It is super easy to manipulate, but frankly, it's just a little bit too easy. Given any sort of wind, this just pops right off, and now your vestibule's flapping around in the wind, being all sorts of noisy and annoying. Now the mechanism on the Duplex, on the other hand, is far less handy, far less easy to manipulate. It's just a little toggle, a little 1.5 maybe inch long toggle. It kind of slides through a little nylon ring. So again, in inclement weather, especially late at night, if you get some little storm or squall that kicks up, it's going to take a little bit more work to actually manipulate this vestibule. But frankly, it's going to stay where you put it. Unlike the Durston, where that magnet mechanism it is nowhere near enough security to actually keep your vestibule where you want it in a wind. So now that we've spoken just a little bit about why it is that I got the Durston in the first place, let's talk about some of the reasons why I sent it home after 1,200 miles. First and foremost, one of the first things you're going to notice about these tents, aside from like the color difference and geometrical difference, is that the Durston is just way larger than the Duplex. Obviously this was, in some strange way, one of the selling points, just to have that extra headroom and some more space in the vestibules. But really, in practicality, when you're on a thru-hike, Tent sites can be rather competitive. You might not always be able to get a perfect tent site. You might not always be able to get a tent site, frankly, that's even going to be able to accommodate a tent this size. Whereas the Duplex, I never really had any trouble finding room for this tent. So now we have these sides of the tents pinned closed as they would be in an inclement weather situation. So this would be any sort of really sort of like downpours or deluges of rain and things like this. So the Durston, obviously the zipper is super enticing and just kind of bolsters the weatherworthiness of the tent. And that's really neat, but frankly, zippers are also on tents a pretty profound liability. They just get gummy with dust, especially on the PCT or the CDT where there's so much dust along the trail that those zippers can get gummed up and really stop functioning well or even come off their tracks in a really bad situation. On the Duplex, on the other hand, the mechanism that's going to secure your vestibule is, again, it's going to be that same toggle and loop situation, and then a little bullhorn down here where you just kind of pin down the vestibule. So the tent is designed with one layer of vestibule overlying the other, as you can see right here. And what you would want to do, it is going to take a little bit more time, but what you're going to want to do when you pitch this tent is pitch it so that the fabric which is on top is on the windward side. So if you got the winds blowing in from this side, this tent to be pitched correctly, whereas if the wind was coming in, if you had pitched on the leeward side, the wind's coming in from this direction, you're definitely going to have a lot of flapping and vibration to listen to throughout the course of that storm. So another sort of selling point for the Durston is that the door opens in an upwards direction. So once you undo both of these zippers, you can kind of roll the door upwards. There's a couple of elastic bands where you can tie that up and out of your way. Whereas on the Duplex, the big rainbow door, you're going to undo those two zippers, and then the door is just going to lay on the ground right there in front of you. Honestly, to me, the rainbow door and the door laying on the ground, I guess it's technically a little bit of a bummer, but it never really bums me out that much. It doesn't really get in my way, and it's really not that big of a deal. I mean, whether the door is up in the air and you're hitting yourself on the head, or whether it's on the ground and now you got to deal with climbing over it, either way, I didn't really find that to be much of a benefit in the Durston. So another thing about the Durston that was a little bit of a bummer for me is that these vents are such a marketable point, but frankly, I didn't find them to do anything whatsoever. They really, I get perhaps there's some scientific way of calculating exactly how much ventilation this is actually going to yield, but I found it to yield minimal to no discernible difference in terms of ventilation. And frankly, with a tent that's pitched so much closer to the ground, yeah, you might be gaining a little bit of weatherworthiness, but this isn't really going to help you, and frankly, you're just losing so much ventilation in this tent. So I'm sort of here halfway inside of the Durston at this point, and one thing I'll point out that I do think is kind of neat is these little stays. They have these little vertical stays in each of the four corners of the bathtub floor, so that's going to kind of help keep water from dripping into the tent. It's a pretty neat idea, but frankly, in my Durston, I already have one of those stays has poked through the sill nylon material on the bathtub floor. I'm not rough with my gear, but I don't know if it's just a matter of they should have designed it, perhaps Dan should have designed it with like an extra layer of protection just so that that stay isn't poking out through the material that it's housed in. So before we get into sort of the summary and the most important reason why I switched from the Durston back to my Duplex, just wanted to mention that if you're enjoying this video, please do be sure to hit like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment down below if you have any questions about any of these points. I do read and respond to every single comment on my channel. Speaking of my channel, if you are interested in hiking the AT or the PCT or the CDT, I did create videos from all three of my hikes. So those are daily dispatches from the trail. Definitely be sure to go back and check those out. If you just like scenic shots or want to learn some more about those trails and the conditions, I did create daily dispatches from all three of those trails. Finally, I would like to mention that there are two great videos I would definitely recommend you check out that talk about this issue of these two tents specifically. First off, I'd recommend Dan Durston's video on how to pitch the XMid. It's about an 18-minute instructional video, and if you kind of read between the lines, you can definitely glean exactly how specific that tent needs its pitch to be. The second video is by another YouTube dude called Juergen, and he did a great comparison of the Duplex and the XMid Pro 2. Both of those videos will be linked in the description down below, so be sure to check those out. So really, in summary, the main reason why I switched from the Durston back to my Duplex, it wasn't so much the vents that don't really do anything. It wasn't the magnetic toggles that just come loose in any sort of wind. It wasn't even those little 4-inch stays in the four corners of the bathtub that wind up poking through the floor material and damaging the tent. The main reason why I switched from the Durston back to my Duplex was just the difficulty in pitching. So not only is it an incredibly large footprint that you're going to need to really explore to try and find a spot large enough to even accommodate the tent, but the order of operations is so incredibly insistent. So you need to one, find a plot of land large enough to accommodate this tent, and then when you do throw out the tent, ahead of staking the four corners, you need to be mindful of the fact that the bathtub in which you're sleeping is a rectangle which is oriented askew to the overall rectangular footprint of the tent. So you can check out this diagram. I'll show you that the sleeping space is not at all the way that you would expect for the rectangular footprint of the tent. So once you've found your spot that's big enough, once you've oriented the floor that you'll be sleeping on correctly relative to the footprint of the tent overall, now you need to start driving stakes. So you need to stake each one of those four corners, but even according to Dan Durston's instructional video on how to pitch this tent, you only want to drive those stakes about halfway, because by his own admission, there's a very real chance that you may need to move one or two of those stakes. So you stake it halfway, and then you tighten up your floor, and hopefully your stakes are good. If not, you got to move them. And you know, be mindful of the fact that these super short guy lines. So the shortness of these guy lines on the Durston really have two major points that make them really less than ideal. I do understand probably that the reason why Dan Durston is using these super short guy lines is so that you can get the tent so much closer to the ground and really bolster that weatherworthiness. But the two major drawbacks of having guy lines this short, for one, if you have gotten your tent properly pitched up and that last stake happens to be above a root or a rock or something like that, now you may need to pull up all your stakes and totally reorient your entire tent, because you just don't have enough flexibility with such a short guy line to accommodate any sort of obstacle under the ground. The second thing about having these super short guy lines, which could be incredibly frustrating, was that there were a few nights on the Pacific Crest Trail where I wasn't able to drive my stakes, nor was I able to create a dead man anchor as we relied on through the Sierra in the snow. So of course, any hiker knows that in that sort of situation, you need to gather up some rocks, and you need to bolster the anchor point of those corners and stakes. So the thing about having such an incredibly short guy line, however, is that when you're stacking those rocks to really kind of shore up that anchor point, to shore up that stake, you're really putting your tent in super serious danger at that point. Because if any sort of wind comes through and jostles your tent or tumbles a rock, you can very easily rip the Dyneema, as I did twice on two separate corners on two separate occasions with the Durston. So those short guy lines are just a huge liability. Not only can you not accommodate any sort of obstacle under the ground, but if you do, and when you do, frankly, need to rely on rocks to bolster your anchor points, you're really putting your tent in very serious danger. So really, whatever sort of weatherworthiness you're gaining with the Durston over the Duplex, frankly, it's not that huge of a difference, and you're losing way more than you're gaining. For one, let's back up and just say, if you are really worried about super inclement weather situations, again, neither one of these tents is going to get you there, so look for a four-season tent and don't get either one of these tents. And number two, you're just not going to be in terrible weather situations that regularly on any of the big three trails in the US. So what weatherworthiness you might be gaining from the Durston is just totally outweighed by the difficulty of setting it up, the requirements of the huge footprint, the insistence on a perfect pitch and exactly perfect angles, the risk of the short guy lines, and just the persnicketiness and order of operations that it demands in order to get a perfect pitch. So in my mind, it's just a no-brainer. Definitely the Duplex might have a couple of drawbacks in terms of weatherworthiness, but its ease of pitch, its super small footprint, its versatility, those nice long guy lines that can accommodate any sort of obstacle under the ground. In my experience, in my estimation, it's a no-brainer. The Duplex, far and away, is a better tent for a through hike than the Durston XMid Pro 2.